calculations there.
Sure. And just to sort of make one point here, obviously Recurve played a big role in developing Caltrac, and we built the OpenEE meter. Both of those now are being governed by the Linux Foundation. So there's a formal governance structure that exists that is being driven by stakeholders now, and that process has evolved over the last year, but it kind of points to the value of having, not just one organization be responsible for driving the methods. And I think the commission really spoke to that as being a value of population NMAC is that it can represent the best practices of the community, while also providing some other pathways for making savings claims where appropriate. So kind of getting into some of these details a little bit. So we've been kind of unpacking, some of the requirements, and we actually filed the first savings claim for a population NMAC program a couple of weeks ago, or we helped file it. So there's some lived experiences here that are kind of informing this conversation a little bit. But one of the distinctions that the rulebook makes is between gross, net, and peak savings. So just to kind of level set with everybody what we're talking about here, because these terms can be, and are really overpacked. There's adjusted gross, there's net to gross. Peak demand has its own kind of peculiarness to it. So in general, what we're thinking about when we think about gross savings is the difference between what you would have been projected to have you consumed in terms of energy based on the preconditions of your building. So this is what ABA02 refers to as an existing conditions baseline. So you project forward what you would have used, and you subtract from that what you actually consumed. And so this is when we talk about Caltrac methods, we're generally talking about the approach that's demonstrated on the left here, where you're taking the actual consumption relative to the projections that would have been made for the weather conditions that actually existed in the post-treatment period. Now that's a little bit different than what we're doing when we're making a savings claim for the commission, because they're asking for the weather conditions to be normalized to a typical weather year. So we're not actually looking for what the energy consumption would have been in the post-treatment period. We're asking what the energy consumption would have been if the weather conditions were typical of a typical weather year. Now, who even knows what a typical weather year is anymore? But nonetheless, there is a formal hourly matrix of temperatures that is published by the state of California that are known as the CZ 2010 and have been recently updated. So it's got a new name now. But those hourly temperature values are what's used to annualize savings to a typical weather year. But they also require a full 12 months of reporting so that you can normalize your reporting period savings to that typical, or reporting period consumption to that typical weather year, from which you can then subtract what you would have used in a typical weather year if your baseline conditions had held versus what you would have used in a typical weather year if your reporting conditions had held. And that becomes the basis for your savings claim. Now from that, you need to adjust for net savings, which will be I'll get to in a minute. But the third piece to this is this peak demand savings, which tied us in knots a couple of weeks ago as we were trying to figure out what it even means, because it was built around DEER values and deemed savings, so it doesn't actually make any sense when you're talking about metered savings. But this will be something that we have to deal with, I think, in the coming year. But what they're asking there is for your savings to be calculated for particular hours of the day on particular days of the year for the climate zones within which those different projects that you've done exist. All right, so if you're doing a project in climate zone 4, for example, which I think is somewhere in the San Jose area, then on between September 3rd and September 5th, between 2 and 5 p.m., you need to know what the usage would have been in that building if the temperatures during those days were not the actual temperatures of those days, but were those temperatures of those days in a typical weather year as defined by the climate zone normal temperatures. It's insane. And so how do you even know that, right? Which has been, you know, some of the challenge here of interpreting NMEC in the context of these new rules. So this is, you know, just kind of giving you a sense of some of the complexity associated with that. If you're looking at a commercial office building and you want to know what, you know, this Wednesday through Friday was that defined that peak period, you can't just take an average because, you know, weekdays and weekends are different. You can't just take the actual consumption because you need to normalize it to what would have been the case if the weather conditions were that of a typical weather year during those 3 days. So, so this is part of the openness and transparency of the methods and the approach, is that we've come up with a way to solve for this. And you can, but it's not secret, right? It's not a secret sauce, and it may not even be the best way. It's just like the first way that we're trying to figure out how to come up with suitable metrics. I've linked to it here so that everybody can go look and see how we've done it. And again, this is part of the Caltrac process, is designed to interrogate and investigate these methods so to make sure that they're faithfully representing what we're trying to represent in making these savings claims. I won't touch too much on net savings, but again, once you get to the typical weather year, you have to go one step further and you apply a lifetime value based on the measures that you've installed, and a haircut for your net to gross adjustment. Now, for most existing measures, there's a net to gross default, but the Commission did leave some space to submit your own net to gross claim. Perhaps by running a comparison group to create your own net to gross adjustment. I think for multifamily that has something like a 0.55 default, this seems a little bit more compelling. For residential, the net to gross is already, you know, fairly high, so your value add might be somewhat minimal in terms of the cost of creating a comparison group. But nonetheless, that optionality is existing in the rule book.